Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be doing the Try a Poem tag. This was an idea that originally began as the Try a Chapter tag, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think it may have been Mercedes who was the first person to do that. And the basic idea behind that was you get a bunch of books that you are interested in reading, you read the first chapter from those books, and based on your initial feelings on those first chapters, you decide which book you would like to carry on with. And again, I'm not entirely sure, but I think the first person to convert this idea into a Try a Poem tag may have been Jen Campbell. And the premise is basically the same. You get a bunch of poetry collections you are interested in reading, read the first poem, and then based on which one you enjoyed the most, you pick which collection you would like to carry on with. So from my poetry shelf, I have picked 5 collections that I think I may be interested in reading soon, and before I make myself comfortable on my bed and read the first poems from these collections, I'm going to talk you through them and my initial thoughts before going into them. So this first one is Handwriting by Michael Ondaatje. I've not read anything from this poet before, and I think these poems have a lot to do with like Sri Lankan culture, and that isn't something that I've read a lot of before. I think sometimes when you're reading a collection about something that you don't necessarily know a lot about, it can either make you feel really disconnected or it can be a really enriching experience depending on what kind of mood you're in when you go into it. So I'll see how I get on with the first poem in this one. Next up I have Samedi by Maria Apicella. Now I've never read any of Maria's writing before, but I have met her a couple times and I have heard her read from this collection. We went to the same university, although at different times, and when I was vice president of the English and Creative Writing Society at my university, she very kindly did a talk for us, and that's when I heard her read. I really enjoyed what I heard from her, but it was a couple of years ago now, so I do think I will be coming to this with quite fresh eyes, and I've never actually read any of her poems before. Next up I have All the Journeys I Never Took by Rebecca Tantonay. I think this collection has a lot to do with themes of coming of age, and also based on what I know from work I've read published by Burning Eye Books before, I think it will be very heavily influenced by spoken word, slam poetry kinds of styles, which is always very much up my street, and again I've not read anything from this poet before, so it'll be interesting to see what I think of their work. Next collection I have is Inkstone by Jamie McKendrick. This is a collection I picked up on a bit of a whim because I had some bookstore credit that I needed to spend. Not read anything from this poet before, but I know this collection has to do with differing perspectives of like home and abroad and the wild and the domestic. And the final collection I'm going to try out today is Insomnia by John Kinsella. Again, another poet that I've not read anything from before, but I do know that this writer's work is really highly critically acclaimed. The blurb says that this collection is about our current crisis of being, and it does seem like this collection is trying to cram a lot in. It says it is about art and music and imagination and empathy, so it does sound like there's a lot going on in this collection, but that's normally something that I quite enjoy in poetry collections when they cover a real breadth of topics, so I'm looking forward to seeing how I get on with this one. So they are all 5 of the poetry collections I'm going to try out today. I'm going to go sit on my bed and then I will report back. Because it's the first one that I read. The first poem in this was called A Gentleman Compares His Virtue to a Piece of Jade. I didn't really get on with this first poem, which I don't think is any reflection of the quality of writing. I just felt that there was a real sense of disconnect with these poems, with this first poem. And I think that's a fault of my lack of cultural awareness as opposed to a fault of the writing. There were a lot of geographical and historical references in this first poem that I just didn't get. And while I'm very firmly of the belief that you don't need to get all of the references in a piece of writing to appreciate it on some level, it just really took me out of the poem because I didn't really know what was going on. On first reading, I didn't notice a particular rhyme scheme or structure to this poem. I'm normally quite a fan of poems that don't have a particular structure, although I do tend to gravitate towards poems that do have some sort of significant emphasis on rhyme or sound effect. It's not necessarily an indication of how the collection will continue, but it just didn't grab me at this moment in time. Moving on to Psalmody, I really enjoyed the use of sound effect in this first poem. These poems don't have any titles, so it is just poem number 1 in this collection, but there was a real emphasis on sibilance, especially at the start of the first poem. Sibilance is basically like alliteration, but specifically with S sounds, so that repeated S sound in the word, although they're not necessarily at the start of the word. So we have Psalms whispering like a cassette. I think the first poem sets up the collection really, really well. The full collection is about a religious woman and her relationship with a not religious man and how they are navigating that juxtaposition. The poem was free verse, which again is something that I do really enjoy, so I think this one is a pretty strong contender for which one I would like to continue with. So moving on to All the Journeys I Never Took, the first poem in this collection is called Circled, and I think, like Maria's collection, the first poem in this really sets up the collection really, really well. It is made up of 5 4-line stanzas, and the final stanza reads, "We were all outlining futures with the circle of our bodies, journeys we were yet to move towards." And, you know, I think that's just a great setup, the fact that this collection is going to be about going on journeys, about exploring relationships. That first poem is about like a childhood disco, and that was an image that I really connected with and enjoyed. In saying that, there was nothing that particularly grabbed me about the writing in the first poem. There was a strong sense of rhythm and sound effect in it, but not in a way that I felt was particularly unique or stand out. Although that's not to say there wouldn't be standout incredible poems in the remainder of the collection, it's just from that first poem, it didn't blow me away. Moving on to Inkstone, the first poem in this collection, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, was Apotheosis, and it's basically a poem about beekeeping. It breaks down this interaction between a beekeeper and a bee, and it shows the really odd juxtaposition of that, how much of an interference it is. And it examines something which is probably only a few seconds long in a huge amount of depth, and I think that's a remarkable quality in poetry, being able to show the intricacies and the depth of a situation that only lasts for a moment. I also really enjoy poems that explore things like odd juxtapositions, and I think this is a fantastic example of the wild and the domestic interacting. I thought the sound effects in this poem were really subtle, and I love when you're reading a poem and you're like, did that rhyme? Where was the rhyme there? Like when it's not entirely obvious on your first read. So this one's a definite contender as well. I really enjoyed this first poem. And moving on to the final collection I tried out, Insomnia. Now, this first poem was called the Bulldozer Poem, and I think it's got a similar kind of thing to Inkstone in that it is examining a juxtaposition between the human world and the natural world. And it is a poem that basically explores the existence of bulldozers and the power that they have and what they are used for, what the intentions behind their use are. And I thought that was just such a fascinating image to look at. And again, I love when a poem can really break down the intricacies of something that may only last a few moments. There are 16 3-line stanzas and 1 final 4-line stanza, and that may be a specific form, but off the top of my head it's not ringing any bells. Again, it had a use of sound effect in rhyme that was incredibly subtle, and when I was reading it I did have that feeling, like I mentioned with Inkstone, where I was like, oh, there was a rhyme there, where was the rhyme? It wasn't immediately obvious, and that's something that I really, really appreciate as opposed to a traditional end rhyme, although that's something that I still also do enjoy. This poem was the one that gave me the most significant feeling of wanting to get a pen out and do a close reading on the poem and really unpack what it was saying. The references it was it was making were ones that resonated with me and I recognised. So again, this one is definitely a contender as well. So I am down to Insomnia, Inkstone, and Psalmody. This is really, really hard. I want to read all 3 of them, and obviously I will read all 5 of these collections at some point. And you know, if I really wanted to, I could read all of them now, but that's not the point of this tag. I think perhaps I have to make a decision based on what I'm in the mood for. Although Maria's collection is the one that has been on my TBR for the longest amount of time. Okay, I think I've made a decision because it is almost a year since I moved away from Aberystwyth, and I do quite often miss it a lot. So I think a great way of marking that and paying tribute to it will be to read Psalmody. You know, Maria's an Aberystwyth graduate and these poems are set in Wales. So this one is what I'm going to read next. If you want to hear my full thoughts on this one once I've read it, do keep your eyes peeled for my May wrap-up. So I think I'm going to get back into my bed and finish off reading this one. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know what it is that you look for in a poetry collection. Is there certain techniques or aspects you are drawn to? Are you drawn to poems that rhyme, that have a set form? Do you prefer free verse? Let me know down in the comments. I hope you guys are having a brilliant week, and I will talk to you in my next video.